Hello and welcome to Head-Mounted Destinations, a podcast about VR and VR game development. We provide our perspective as developers and give you, the listener, a sneak peek behind the curtain as to how VR games are made. I'm your friendly neighborhood host and level designer Carlos, and with me as always...
Hello, I'm Matt. I'm a gameplay programmer.
And today, we're celebrating the 1-year anniversary of Head-Mounted Destinations. It's been 1 whole year that we've been producing the show, doing the audio editing and the video editing, uploading it to different platforms such as Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And if you're on any of those platforms, feel free to give us a like, subscribe, comment, engage with us however you can. We're very open to it. But enough about that. Matt, this is it. This is 1 year. How's it going?
It's going amazing. Honestly, if I think back to a year ago, starting out, we didn't know anything. And we still don't know very much, but by golly, we have learned a lot about podcasting. I think we've gotten good at selecting interesting things to talk about. And honestly, the thing that I'm jazzed about the most is how much value we've gotten out of it personally. You know, like when we have these conversations, I think we get a lot of value out of it and we come away thinking differently about VR as a space. And
yeah, I very much agree with that. Like, just taking, for instance, that conversation we had about hypersports, right? Like, I don't know, just one day it goes from like, hey, isn't Lone Echo cool, to now we have like expanded this whole understanding of like what VR sports games could be and or like what is making the ones that are successful. And I can like think about that and those different kind of like pillars and elements we identified. I can think about that and apply that to my own side projects or potentially my own like professional work. And yeah, it's just a lot of like XP being added to the mind.
Yeah, we've really leveled up. This is level 2 now of Head-Mounted Destinations.
And just to take a step back to the conception of the show, if I were to give like a sort of condensed timeline of how things went down, it started all with us having these conversations about VR games while we were working out. Like, we'd get together once or twice a week with a couple of our other game dev friends, and we'd talk about VR. We'd get really into it, and it sort of just naturally figured like, hey, this is actually really fun, but also we are going through the year inside now. So I can't meet with you to go to the gym. Do you want to just keep having these conversations? And like at that point, I was like, yeah, definitely. Like I've very much been wanting to do a podcast or some sort of content like collaboration with someone, whether that be a game project, a video, a podcast.
I mean, I remember I sent you a text. I was like, hey man, you want to do a podcast? And like at the time, you know, we had these conversations and it was kind of a long road to turn that into something that people want to listen to. I remember we had a lot of conversations before when we were sort of setting up the show. It's like, what should this be? What's the target audience?
Yeah, and that was really tough. I feel like, at least because it was our first stab at it, we weren't sure like, should we just go like talk supernaturally and, you know, it'll be for the devs? Should we just like try to put it for people who like aren't in the game dev at all, but like video games? And then I think, you know, we were both pretty in agreement on wanting to stay away from any sort of kind of like hype show type feel. Like, we're not here to talk about the new exclusives. We're here to get into the, let's say, trenches.
Yeah, there are a lot of podcasts that focus on current news or interviews with people. And, you know, we wanted to do something that was a little bit more thoughtful and focus in on the developer perspective, the developer's eye view of the market and the space and the development process. And what is it like to make these things?
I think we've been good at communicating that so far without getting too in the weeds, because I think us as developers, you know, especially the more detailed oriented we get, it gets so easy to just go too far into the weeds and then like lose whoever you're talking to. But through doing this show, another thing I feel like at least I've learned, is like how to, to take something from Ghostbusters, like how to keep it English, Egon, like, and in doing that, like, it helps me to talk about that stuff with a lot of my friends who aren't into VR, just meaning like they may not have tried VR yet. They may not know about it, or they just think it's not for them. But either way, like now I find it much easier for me to at least attempt to explain things that are happening from like gameplay experiences, or like how the game is like made.
Yeah, I'd say that's the hardest line that we've been trying to ride, is not making it too complex and not understandable, not using too much jargon, explaining things where necessary, but also not like simplifying too much. I think it's easy to go too far on the side of just like skipping over the complexity, because the complexity is where a lot of the interesting stuff is in the dev process. So I want to compare this to, recently I've been watching a fair number of like music theory videos on YouTube. I don't know anything about music theory. I don't play music. I do not have a trained ear. None of this. But seeing people talk passionately about this thing and using all this jargon, and I can like sort of follow along, makes me more interested in appreciating music at like a technical level. And I hope this podcast can do the same thing for people, where they hear the flow of the conversation, the things that we focus on, the way that we talk about these games, these experiences, and they sort of can start to appreciate it from a different angle as they're playing, because they understand now how developers think about the experiences.
Yeah, I think I could say that that's probably one of, if not the core hope I had for the show, is like listeners gain a new appreciation for the things they generally play mindlessly or within some focus state, But like, it's very much, I do feel like it is less nowadays, but I think it was often, not even like 5 years ago or whatever, that like someone would just grab a game, play it, and then, toss it once they were done. And nothing really goes into the thought of like, oh, wow, how is this thing I'm playing like put together? And I think that is like way more prevalent nowadays, but
yeah,
maybe not as much as I wish. So that's why we're doing this.
No, yeah, I think you're right. We've definitely seen an expansion of the like gamer consciousness. And I think part of that comes with like early access and, people learning to navigate the marketplace of unfinished games and seeing that like process of completion, I think has helped people understand how games get put together. But, maybe that's missing from the VR space. And that's the value that we bring to listeners, is for VR games specifically, how does it come together?
Yeah.
And it's also been valuable for us as developers, talking over these things and analyzing them. So maybe we should talk about some of the biggest concepts that we've talked about in this show that have continued to assist us day to day and help us think about things.
One of the concepts that sticks with me, like on a daily, is like regarding ergonomic kinesthetics. And like, I think about this as I'm playing the game. I think about it as, we work on our side project together. Like, I'm always having these like short convos with you where it's like, oh, hey, like, I like how this is working, but, I think I'm going to make my level like this because I don't want the player looking down or looking in this direction. I don't want them to like stress out their arm. And so that's something that like, I think is a really great thing that I had already started thinking about through my initial work on VR, but doing this show has like really just hammered it into my mind, and it's become like just another thought process, like another cycle within my grand programming.
Yeah, there's so many like little elements to that of like, don't have the player reach above their shoulder level, don't have the player look down for extended periods, allow the player to like move around their play space a little bit, don't have them stand in one spot, or allow them to play seated.
Try to avoid the T-Rex arms.
Yeah, don't create motions that might get blocked by the chair arms if they're playing seated. So yeah, that's like a super valuable aspect, is just always in the back of your head, like a human is going to be playing this game and making these motions, make it pleasurable. And I think that sort of spirals into more generally like having your core loop be enjoyable from like a motion angle. We tend to praise arcadey games like Pistol Whip, or Swarm, or, we talked about The Climb.
And we do that because, like you said, these games have like very much like to the point game loop that's also very satisfying, right? So Pistol Whip, it's like shoot, 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 dodge. Like now I'm actually pistol whipping someone. The Climb, it's just, okay, reach out, grab a rock, reach out, grab a rock. Swarm, you're like Spider-Man swinging and shooting guns, right? So again, you're not really going too complex into like what you're doing, but you're having a lot of fun.
I think the people buying games on the marketplaces sort of confirm this, because like Beat Saber, Pistol Whip, these things are the most popular games. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the main reasons is that this loop is short, this core loop, where like you're doing a limited set of motions that feel cool, that play into that fantasy, they feel good. It has, usually shorter levels, so you're like, intense action and then a bit of time to relax. So there's that pacing, that like rhythmic pacing. We've talked about this a fair bit as we've talked about these different games. And I think that's a huge lesson that all developers should keep in mind, even if you're building games that don't fit into this sort of short session, short loop form. I think really making it easy for the player to engage with their fantasy, making it easy for the player to like feel cool and feel good doing motions, even if you're making a longer form game. I think that's like just a really valuable analytical angle.
We like all games alike. We don't just straight up praise the arcadey ones because they have a good, like, to the point core loop. To use a metaphor, if you were taking children's like building blocks, with the wooden blocks with the letters on them and stuff, each of those blocks is going to be like a mechanic or a mutator. And in order to build your castle, which would be, say, Half-Life Alyx, you need to put a lot of these little mechanics and mutators together. But you got to make sure each tower is structurally fun and sound before you build a wall to connect it to another tower to continue the castle. You know what I mean? So yeah. I think, it's often easy to praise, like, damn, this is a good tower, i.e., like, this is a fun game loop in Pistol Whip or Swarm, like, great tower you got here. But the next level is certainly getting multiple towers and showing that, like, mastery between, like, tech design and what have you, to now start taking these multiple towers and combining them into this sweet castle VR experience.
I think a good example of that, concretely, is Half-Life Alyx, because like that game has a lot of these, to use your analogy, towers, like the force pull for objects, very pleasing. Right. And there's a little bit of mastery there. The reloading process, eject the clip, pull out the ammo, slot it in, rack the gun.
Yeah, I would almost call those building blocks, honestly.
Yeah, I think it's fractal, right? Yes, these things are building blocks for a larger castle, but they are also castles in themselves.
Okay.
We see that with like arcade games have fewer mechanics, but they're like very tight and they play on them.
There's subtleties that get revealed, I think, over time, is what you're getting at, right?
And it's sort of the same thing with each element in Alyx. The point is making the like small part of your game, like the individual elements, very tight is important. And we see that where like games that are just sort of sloppy and loose really suck to engage with. I don't really want to name names, but I would say Asgard's Wrath is an example where no individual element is very tight or pleasing to do. And so then you're left with this disconnect where it's not very engaging at a low level, even if you want to be pulled into the game at a high level, like you're enjoying the story or you're enjoying going through these levels in, it's fulfilling a fantasy at a high level. It is not succeeding at a base level, in terms of the specific kinesthetics and like the combat experience, all these things.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like that game was fun to play, but it definitely hit a ceiling like fairly quickly because you felt how underdeveloped the VR aspects of it were.
That segues nicely into talking about immersion, which I think is a topic that's come up a fair bit on the show in different contexts. And it's something that is really obvious when you're talking about VR. You're like, oh, I want to be in this other space. I want to be in this virtual reality.
You want to look like an Oculus, like a Japanese Oculus commercial. Like, I've seen the Resident Evil 4 VR commercial that they're playing in Japan, and that's where you want to fucking be. The second you put the headset on, you feel like 50 zombies like grabbing you. You get tossed through a fucking like wall somehow, and now you're fighting a giant, and it's all there. You feel the rattle of his footsteps. Like, that's the type of immersion you want to feel. We're probably many years away from that, plus thousands of dollars, because you need to buy a haptic suit for that type of stuff. But that is to all say, like, you want to be as immersed as possible while being as comfortable as possible, which I think is like two concepts that like we've talked about a lot that tend to like butt up against each other. The immersion and then the reducing friction.
Yeah. Just to play on your example of feeling the footsteps of the giant a little bit, I think that's really a place where it becomes counterintuitive how to increase immersion. And this is something I think we've talked about a fair bit, is realism and simulationism does not necessarily lead to immersion. And people who don't have a lot of experience in VR are often thinking like, oh, what if I got a treadmill so I can like actually walk in place and walk around? What if I got gloves? What if I got a haptic suit? And, you know, we talked about hand tracking and how hand tracking isn't actually the best thing for games, potentially.
Yes, our very first episode.
Yeah, our very first episode. We talked about physicalized combat and how that maybe isn't as effective at immersing the player as something a little bit more abstracted. Where I think we diverge from a lot of people's thinking is you actually increase immersion by making the world a little bit more abstract and teaching the player quickly about the rules of your world. So it's like, very clearly, you can interact with this. This thing works this way. And not, oh, it's so real, the whole world is your sandbox. Because then the player comes in with a bunch of expectations of what they can do, and then they're disappointed.
Yep.
And having your expectations violated decreases immersion very quickly.
Yeah, it's very true that like any little thing can reduce that immersion, and really ultimately it is about, I think the way we put it was creating a consistent rule set within your world. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, actions and reactions, but as long as it's like consistent what you can and cannot interact with.
I would say key games to look at we talked about Phantom Covert Ops and how it presents these interactable elements that are, you know, visually marked as interactable and reuse a lot of the same motions. We talked about Red Matter, again, clearly marks what's interactable and creates little fun, almost mini games with those, you know, moving the battery that you can't move too fast, that kind of thing. And yeah, so that's all to say that immersion comes from quickly getting the player to have the correct expectations. We also talked about tutorialization and the difference between getting the player to learn the world logic versus just like spitting like, oh, here's how you do this thing.
Right, yeah. Organic presentation of like mechanics and or rules versus just these floating cards with like text on them, right?
Exactly.
Like if we took Stormland, for instance, in that game, you can rip fruit off of plants and then like squash the fruit and you get XP or health, whatever. So it's like, oh, okay, we taught you this organic thing, pick a fruit off a tree, which we as like cavemen know, right?
But there's levels to that, right? Like they highlight it with like the blue effect or whatever. So it's clearly marked as you can grab this.
Yep.
And you know, there's feedback as you squeeze it. It does a rumble that indicates progress, that your action is being accepted.
And that's tying into the immersion aspect again, because now it's like, oh, I'm squeezing this thing. Let me simulate resistance however I can. And like the squish is like the end of the rumble or whatever.
Right. It's so elementary to developers. I think we fail to mention it a lot of the time, but feedback for player actions is crucial, right? Like if the player does something within the game world, you recognize that with some haptics, with some sound, with a visual effect, with...
Yeah, the general term we like to use is juice. When you got some player feedback, you got to make it juicy. The juicier the game, the more people are like, whoa, wowee. If you're playing Pong, like the very classic Pong, whenever the square pixel hits the paddle, you hear bloop. And that's juice. That's still juice. It's bloop. It was probably the craziest shit in like the 80s or whenever it came out. They were like, oh, it's going bloop. Did you hear the sound card? It just went bloop. But like, actually, that's kind of funny. That reminds me of playing Pong on PS1. They had made a PS1 version of Pong that was like, speaking specifically about juice, that thing was like 3D models. You're in a weird Aztec environment as the Pong board. The ball is turning into multiple balls and they all have like visual effects around them or something like that. And that is an example of like the juice going from like minimal to maximum. Some of my favorite moments was us doing the dearly departed skits.
Yeah.
Like, you know, maybe one day we'll figure out how to make that work. But
what was your favorite skit?
It might have been damn. I remember there was like at least like 2 or 3 bangers. So one I really liked was the like maybe like the Action Man, even though that one I know was kind of like whatever. It just was stupid enough to work in my head, you know, where he's like, I think that was the Swarm intro where it's like, oh, I'm here to kill things, but I'm also a terrible superhero. Hey, like
I think the one that I remember is the one that got meta where it was for the demo episodes maybe. But it was like, hey, you want to buy some games? Oh no, it's the head-mounted Destination boys, run!
Oh yeah,
The theme music, run away!
I think that was music. That was like recommendation royale and or the side quest for more games. Yeah, I really dug. I really dug that idea of just like, get this show away from me! No.
Oh God, they're still here.
And like visually, how did like within the mind's eye, how does that display itself? Is it just our floating thumbnail of Jeff like chasing after these men, or is it the big head-mounted Destinations bubble?
Oh, speaking of Jeff, I feel like that's a criminally underused element of our podcast branding.
True. Yeah. So when we say Jeff, we're talking about like the skeleton guy who's like stuck in VR on our thumbnails and I guess our Twitter handle, our banner and stuff like that. But anyway, so Jeff is this character that we like lovingly put together. He's a very, I don't know, what would you say, foul-mouthed? Like he has a lot of attitude and he's kind of loud.
Yeah, he's gruff, I would say.
And he's just super jazzed about VR games and, you know, the show. And so he's the one that's typically speaking whenever we tweet the show out.
What do we want the show to be like over the next year?
I personally would like to dive further into the video side of this podcast. And to that end, I could see us doing, I'm not sure if that means like seeing more gameplay clips in the video episode or us maybe trying to do the podcast in VR. I have seen that and kind of like tinkered around in some VR chat worlds to see how that works. But I think it would be really neat to see head-mounted Destinations actually performed in VR, since our podcast is so VR enthusiastic and such.
Right. We talked about doing live critiques of demos or games where we play in parallel and we show both of our footages on the screen.
Yeah, I thought that was a really cool idea for like bonus content. 'Cause that is basically, because to me that reads as a let's play, but it's a let's play of like developers actually like, you know, giving developers play the game, but it's like not their game. Like that's always the sort of BuzzFeed hook, right? Like Dishonored developer plays his own level and talks about it. Mm-hmm. And that's great and all, but we're going to be on the other side of that where it's like developers play a different developer's game and talk about it. I think that could be really cool and fun for us, and then insightful for other people watching it because they can see the specific moments and actions we're doing and like what things we're calling out about it. Plus, I don't imagine it would be too difficult to put together on my end for the video stuff.
Yeah.
I do think that's like two very different things though. Us like recording the show in VR and us doing these like let's plays for VR games.
Right.
Both I'm super open to doing and like would want to try out. Maybe we just turn Head Mounted Destinations Volume 2 into like this big experimental period, and then Volume 3 is this like wild head mounted renaissance.
Yeah, I think playing with format is where we should head next.
What are you seeing by that when you say that?
Well, you're talking about recording in VR, we're talking about doing these let's plays. I think maybe doing segments. Like, we could do a segment at the end of the show where we talk about current events or, you know, doing more skits or...
Oh, interesting. Okay. See, I think I was already too in the weeds because I wasn't even seeing this as like, oh yeah, this potentially affects like the whole shape of the show. So like, yeah, I guess actually, you know, naturally we come to this conclusion where looking to the future, we want to experiment a lot. Like, we want to know what the audience likes to see. Whoever keeps watching this show, like, please reach out to us. Tell us what you like to see so we can show you more of that.
Aside from format, I think one thing thinking about the future is where do we want to go in terms of content? We've done different types of topical focuses. We've done sort of deep dive on a specific game. We've focused on broader concepts like locomotion or tutorials or whatnot. We've talked about current events, or at least ranted about Oculus and Facebook and their place in the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about hardware. We've talked about concepts in the dev process, you know, going from alpha to beta, vertical slice, that kind of thing. So do we want to keep that spread? Do we want to do deeper dives on concepts? Do we want to keep focusing on games? I guess it's sort of, you know, what do people find valuable and what do we have fun with?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I'm hoping that we can drive the interaction more in Volume 2 of Head Mounted Destinations, because again, like, I want to know what people like to hear and want to know more about. That way we can give that to them, because in turn I think we're just still going to have a good enriching conversation out of it, and that will be, you know, a good symbiotic relationship.
I want to extend an offer, a challenge, really.
Oh yes.
You, listener, go onto our Reddit or go onto one of our YouTube videos and post a comment with the name of a VR game. We will play that VR game and we will make either an episode or a bonus episode where we talk about that game exclusively. Obviously, we need to be able to get access to the game and play it.
Yeah, if possible, link it with your comment. Like, name of the game, and if you can, like, link to the game so we can just get to there that much quicker. And yeah, we'll give our thoughts on the game. We'll figure out probably some way to tackle it. I don't think it's always going to be some sort of like review episode, but definitely, yeah, we want to know what you're interested in. So send those games to us either through YouTube or through Reddit.
And with that, let's roll the show out.
If you like this episode of Head Mounted Destinations, please share it with your friends. Word of mouth helps us out. To get notified about new episodes, go to headmountedpodcast.com and sign up for our email list.
You can listen to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, or Apple Podcasts.
If you'd like to discuss this episode or suggest future topics, visit our subreddit at reddit.com/r/headmountedpodcast.
Thank you for listening, and we will see you at the next Head Mounted Destination.